Civil liberties was the name of the game today at your hearing. The Corker-Kane legislation is one that would enhance the power of the executive branch of government to wage war and send troops and U.S. forces abroad. What was the reaction to your subcommittee to that?
We had a great panel, and one of them was Professor Jonathan Turley, who's an expert on this, and he made a point, I think, and made it very clearly that our founding fathers were unanimous in saying that the power to declare war belonged with Congress. There's a Madison quote, and a lot of people were quoting Madison at the hearing, but there's a Madison quote that I think really brings it home when Madison says that the executive branch is the branch most prone to war. Therefore, the Constitution, with studied care, vested that power in the legislature. And that's what this is all about. Who should have the power? Congress, which is closer to the people, and the power is spread among many more people, or one person who's in the White House. Our founding fathers thought it should be Congress, but we've drifted away from that, and there's a new resolution out there, this Kane-Corker authorization for force, and that resolution, we think, gives too much power to the president.
Well, that brings up another point that was discussed throughout the hearing. The last time there was a declaration of war was following Pearl Harbor in 1941. And the Korean War, no action was taken whatsoever. They relied on the United Nations. Vietnam, Desert Storm, all were taken without a formal declaration of war. Would this restore that responsibility to the House in the future and its U.S. Senate as well?
Well, you know, I asked Secretary Pompeo about this during the confirmation hearing, and he said, well, for the past generation or so, we haven't declared war, and historically people have come to understand that the president can do this on his own, and he says everyone agrees, and my response was, except for the founding fathers, who profoundly disagreed. There have been times, though, that we voted. It hasn't always been a declaration of war, but to President Bush's credit, when he went into Iraq, he asked Congress for permission. They didn't call it a declaration of war, they called it a use or an authorization for the use of military force, an AUMF, but they still voted. So in some ways it was similar to a declaration of war, and it was that Congress was giving their permission. We also voted after 9/11. Many people, let's just call them the neoconservatives, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, let's say, they think the president should just be able to make this decision on his own. It would slow him down too much. But interestingly, when we've been attacked, we've been almost unanimous. Myself, everybody, when we were attacked on December 7th, 1941, on December 8th, FDR asked both houses, a joint session of Congress, nearly unanimous to go to war against Japan because they had attacked us.
One dissenting vote.
Yeah, same thing with 9/11. When President Bush came to a joint house and asked for a declaration of war, nearly unanimous. I think one vote again. But Congress can act and can move, and we can actually be more unified and more in support of our soldiers if we'll vote. But if presidents do this willy-nilly all the time, all over the planet, at the end of the committee I asked the question, what do we tell the parents of the 4 soldiers who died in Mali? There's not been any debate up here whether we should be in Mali.
Final question. Senator Sanders made a point that I heard your father, Congressman Ron Paul, make in 2007 during a Republican presidential debate, that we made a mistake covertly overthrowing the Mossadegh government in Iran, bringing to power the Shah, and that led to the Iranian Revolution and the rise of the mullahs in 1979. Now, would your vision of limiting the president's powers and putting it to the executive limit covert operations throughout the world?
I think that we need to have more overt and less covert, and we have to think through the ramifications. There was a book written back in the 80s called Endless Enemies, and it talked about, like when Mossadegh was overthrown, what happened? We had a more authoritarian ruler, the Shah, but he was more pro-West and more pro-American, and yet he had a secret police, and people were unhappy with him. And so the question is, was that better than letting them elect their own leader? We sort of helped impose this guy, but then enmity built over time, gradually over a decade or two, and you could argue that the revolution in '79 is related to the overthrow of '53. Maybe not directly, but one sets off the other. During the Cold War throughout Africa, we would choose people like Mobutu and other people, Mugabe, who were our dictator. They were on the American side versus the Soviet side, and we knew they were horrible human rights violators, and they didn't have elections, and they stole money from their people, but we just sort of put up with it. But then in the end, is there ultimately a revolution now against some of these leaders that involves radical Islam? And all of a sudden it's like, maybe we're more at risk from radical Islam than we were from Gaddafi, for example. Gaddafi we made a deal with, and then, oh, no, we'll help overthrow him. But when we helped overthrow him, Libya is chaos now. It's a breeding ground for terrorism, much worse than it was under Gaddafi.